I wanted to talk about communication because really everything we do in life, involves other people, communication. I think so many of our issues as humans come back to how we communicate with each other, how we understand each other, how we interact with each other, how we assume what someone else is saying. A lot of our issues are based on the fact that we don't maybe listen to the message that someone's giving us, or that's not portrayed clear enough. Communication is a two-way thing. And I'm going to, I suppose, just follow up on the things that Owen was talking about earlier as well. How we think about ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, how we talk to ourselves is probably sorry, 1 second. I just realized I'm not on screen. So how we feel about ourselves, those conversations we have internally with ourselves. We can have negative self-talk, or we can think about ourselves positively and we can talk to ourselves positively. So being an autistic child and thinking negatively about yourself starts off a whole chain of events, or as Owen talked about, those cycles of self-esteem. So really, we need to look at how autistic people communicate, how often that is misjudged or misinterpreted, and how that affects us and our self-esteem and our ability to actually communicate. When we talk about social skills, we don't always look at where that starts. And that starts with our own relationship with ourselves, how we communicate with ourselves. Also, when we talk about communication, sometimes we forget that it's a two-way thing. Communication has a sender and a receiver and a message. It's a two-way process, but yet a lot of the time, the onus or the blame is put on the autistic child for, not communicating properly, or, having all of these issues with communication. But you have to have a receiver in any communication, so there's two sides to it. And how good are people who are maybe not autistic themselves at actually interpreting what an autistic child is saying, through words, or telling us through something that they're doing, or their actions. I try and stay away from that word behaviors, because it does have such a negative connotation for us. But there's communication. We're always communicating things with people, and it's just looking out for that. So I suppose I wanted to look at our social world today. We're surrounded by, all of us are surrounded by a social world that's constantly giving us stories about ourselves and constantly giving us messages. And that's what I wanted to look at a little bit today, and to give you as parents a bit more insight into how we communicate, how you can bridge that gap between autistic and non-autistic communication, or child and adult communication. Adults aren't that good at listening to kids in general anyway, so it's about really bridging that gap. So we'll start the story. There once was a little girl, that's me in my 1970s duffel coat. I really like this picture because I think it captures me as a kid, daydreaming, kind of happy, just connecting with the world, always seeing the best in people. I would have been very outspoken as a kid. Just said what was in my mind, but early on I got messages from my social world telling me that I shouldn't be asking these things or saying these things. I didn't know I was autistic until 7 years ago. But it's quite obvious that I was communicating and just being autistic in the world, but the world was sending me messages that how I wasn't okay or wasn't acceptable. And when that happens to you as a young child, you begin to mask. And masking is, it's a way of protecting your inner precious self. For me, it felt like building a fortress, to protect this inner me that had been ridiculed and not accepted and rejected in a lot of ways. So it was, well, I'm going to hide this person away, hide this part of me away, this self, and I'm going to project an image that people want to see, So for me, that's just a very brief description of what masking is. There's obviously a lot more to it, but I see it as a response to that trauma of you know, all those messages telling me that it's not okay to be Evaleen. You need to be somebody else. You need to be better. You need to do this, you know, and we have to be careful what messages we're giving to people. So I'm going to have a look at some stories that we're told and the messages within those stories, because we know when we read fables, when we read nursery rhymes, when we read story tales as kids, you know, there's always a message in the story, but are we looking enough at the messages that autistic children are getting? Are we looking at the messages that are being sent to you as parents in those stories that we hear all of the time? And I've just put in a few because obviously there's a whole load of stories. We could spend the whole day discussing them. Once upon a time, there was a child who had difficulty fitting in, you know, and that's the story. That's the narrative. That's the story that we're told. That's the story I believed, you know, even as an adult. Yes, I have difficulty fitting in. And that's the story. And the message within that story is that really it's your child's fault that others exclude them. When we break down the message in that story, it's actually saying, wait, it's your fault that you don't fit in, or that you're being excluded. And I think we have to think about these messages. Here's another one. Once upon a time, there was a child who needed to learn social skills to fit in with the others. Again, a story that we're all told that's, you know, quite acceptable when we talk about autism. Yes, this child needs to go and learn social skills so that they can fit in. What's the message in that story? You know, again, it's telling us that the excluded child, or the one who's different, is the one with communication issues. But we know communication is a two-way thing. So how could it possibly be one person who has all of those difficulties? You know, even though others make no effort to understand them and include them. And these are the messages that we get as autistics all of the time. Let's have a look at one. I think we have one more story. Once upon a time, there was a child who needed to learn how to behave. That's the story. Autism is described as a behavioral, you know, disorder or a behavioral condition. It affects how we behave, and we need to learn how to behave in our social world, and that's the story. And the message within that story is, well, the way we behave is caused by autism. Somehow, autism creates all of these behaviors in somebody. And then we forget to look at the way the world is responding to us as autistic people. So all of the things people say about us are kind of looking at autistics in isolation, but we don't exist in isolation. We exist in the world. We exist in this social world, and we exist as part of it, and we respond to the way people respond to us. So the messages that we get, you know, we pick these up as children. And I'm going to talk about these a little bit more. And, you know, first of all, we need to look at, are these stories true? And are these really the messages that we want to be sending to autistic children? Or is it what we want them to be receiving? Dr. Catherine Crompton and Sue Fletcher Watson tested this theory in Edinburgh University about 3 years ago now, which is shocking really that it hadn't been tested. This idea that autistic people lack social skills, don't know how to communicate. All of that was never actually tested, only up until 3 years ago. So, you know, we've had decades of social skills training and ABA and all of that kind of stuff without anybody actually checking that this thing that they said about us was true. So they did test it a few years ago, and you know, I'll briefly explain this. It's a really, really interesting piece of research. There's lots of YouTube videos of conference presentations by both the researchers. There's articles and research is available to read online. So I'll just keep it summaries of each day. But basically, they had an autistic group, and they had a non-autistic group, and then they had a mixed group of non-autistics and autistics. And the idea that autistic people, that autism creates this, you know, inability for us to communicate, you know, would suggest that if you put a bunch of us together, well, then we wouldn't be able to communicate at all. After all, we have this condition which makes us poor communicators. We don't pick up on social cues. We don't pick up on what other people are feeling, all of that kind of thing. So if you put us all together, well, then we shouldn't be able to actually really communicate with each other at all. The research showed quite the opposite. It actually showed that autistic people have a communication which is specific to us. And if you can see down the very bottom on that graph on the right-hand side, there's a green line on top, and that's how the autistic group performed. We actually did the best. we're actually really good at communicating with other autistic people. And the red line underneath the green line is the non-autistic group, which means that, you know what, non-autistic people are really good at communicating with non-autistic people. Both groups did well. But the yellow line at the bottom is the mixed group. And that shows us that, well, you know what, non-autistic people aren't that good at communicating with autistic people and vice versa. So communication is a two-way thing. And that's why communication broke down, because we had a different style of communication. We had autistic communicators and we had non-autistic communicators. So actually, you know, this research showed lots of things, you know, but it also showed that really autistic people don't have issues picking up on how other people feel. We don't have issues on picking up on social cues. We have issues picking up on social cues which belong to non-autistic people. And guess what? Non-autistic people have those same difficulties picking up on autistic cues and autistic body language and an artistic way of communicating. Look how much research is out there and all of these theories about how to understand our behavior and what we're doing and stimming and when we're moving our bodies. And, well, you know, it's like, well, what are they doing? You know, autistic people don't understand, you know, or non-autistic people have the same deficits, if that's the word you want to use, that autistic people do when we're communicating with each other. So, you know, another thing we have to look at these stories is we can't really evaluate social skills of one person or one group of people on their own without evaluating the way everybody else interacts with us or with them. But that's what's happened. Literally, everything that's written about social skills and autism is just focusing on one group without looking at everybody's social skills towards us. You know, the story that we can't make friends. Oh, the autistic child can't make friends. But you can't make friends on your own. That's not a skill anybody has. Nobody can make a friend on their own. You have to have another person to make a friend with. So why is it the fault of the autistic child that they can't make a friend? How can that even be? You know, without evaluating how other people respond and their peers respond to them, how can it be just our difficulty to make a friend? It's not something we do on our own. There's another story about us, we can't make connections, you know. Well, it's hard to make connections where we are feared and othered and considered odd and weird. And we are considered odd and weird. People think we're strange. You know, people say, what's wrong with that child? What's wrong with him? And they'll say things like, he has autism. You know, they won't even say the word. We are othered. We're put in a different category. You know, we've got special schools, we've got ASD units, we've got schools, and then we have ASD units. We have children, and then we have special needs children. So what we're doing is we're not saying every child is the same. We're not saying they're all equal. We're putting them in a separate category, and that's othering. You know, how can you connect with people when you know that they think you're different to them and everybody else, and they think you're odd? That's really hard to do. How can that be the responsibility of the autistic child to go out into the world and make friends and make connections when this is what they're receiving? You know, if we interact naturally, and this is the thing, I'm going to talk later about our way of communicating, but we know our natural way of communication can be quite direct. We can say what we mean. And when we communicate in our very natural way, and really when you're communicating, you're just, you know, sharing your internal experience with your social world, with somebody else. You just have thoughts, you have feelings, and you're just sharing them. That's all you're doing. But often when we do that, you know, we might be told we're cheeky for taking something literally. You know, to give an example, I was, you know, teaching a class after school. So we rent a room in a school for our drama classes or social skills, social skills classes. You know, and this was a drama class, and I think the boys had to kind of move stuff around the room or something the week before. So I said, boys, we're going to do our drama now, but we can't touch anything in the room. You know, we'll just do our drama. And one of the kids was like, well, how can we do our drama if we can't touch the floor or the chairs and, you know, the teacher in the school was still in the room, and, you know, she actually went, don't be so cheeky. But to me, you know, I was like, well, he's not being cheeky. He took what I said quite literally. So if his only response was, don't be so cheeky, for just asking a question and asking for clarification to something that was really confusing to him, if that was his only response, how's that going to affect his, you know, ability and confidence to ask a question the next time? You know, my response to him was, I'm sorry, I actually phrased that really poorly. What I meant to say was, we can use the classroom, we can use the floor, and we can use the chairs and the tables, but we're just not to touch anything else. I'm sorry I didn't say that clearly. And that was the other response that he got. How would that affect his way to proceed in this world and to communicate the next time? So the responses that we get, you know, shape how we react to things in the next time. You know, a lot of us are told that we're asking too many questions. Asking a question means we need to know. We're asking for clarification. Being told you're asking too many questions sends us a message. Well, stop talking, you know, stop asking. You know, and as parents, we know that the most important thing we can do with our children is keep the lines of communication open, you know. So we need to do that. We need to foster that rather than telling people, you know, oh, you're asking too much. How will this affect how we feel about ourselves the next time we interact with someone? And that's a really important question that we have to ask. What messages is the child getting when we're saying things like that to them? You know, because they're things that we hear as autistics constantly, you know, and you know, so it's about what's that telling them about themselves? How is that making them feel? And how is that affecting their ability to interact? You know, there's lots of stories around eye contact, around empathy, making friends, playing and turn taking and sharing. But how many of these stories explain the reasons behind them? And how many of these stories have been told by people who are actually autistic? You know, if we look at eye contact, even for an example, people would say, oh, you know, he's showing signs of autism because he's not making eye contact. Lots of autistic people, when you ask them what eye contact feels like for them, they will tell you that it feels uncomfortable, it feels intrusive, it's invasive, it can totally make me forget what I'm saying, I can't concentrate when I'm trying to make eye contact. So eye contact can actually be painful for a lot of autistic people. So it's not that we've difficulty making it, it's that it's uncomfortable, intrusive, painful, unnecessary. So why would you try to make somebody do something that's painful, invasive, intrusive, and unnecessary? You know, for me, I'm a very visual person. So when I look away from somebody, that means I'm really concentrating on what they're saying. I'm taking in what they're saying and I'm translating that into my internal language and into pictures so I can actually imagine what they're saying. And I can't do that as a human being. I can't actually do all of that processing and translating and look at your face at the same time, because all of these messages, micro messages, are coming from your face, and I can't process them as well as doing this because I'm a human being. You know, so again, people said that autistic people lack empathy. We can't empathize with other people. We can't understand them. Well, you know, I don't know any of the autistic people that I talk to, you know, talk about are the almost having hyper empathy, having too much empathy. A lot of us can feel other people's pain. A lot of us can feel how somebody else is feeling. We can feel how someone feels towards us. You know, so that whole idea of us lacking empathy is a story that's been told without actually asking autistic people, is it true? How we empathize is often misunderstood. You know, I'll give one example. You know, I do this a lot. When someone tells me a story, I might say, oh, okay, so that's tough. You know, that's like the time when I'll visualize a time in my life where I felt the same, because I'm really trying to empathize with that person. I'm trying to find out, you know, bring their feeling back to something I can really relate to. That's, for me, is empathizing, feeling how they're feeling. But yet someone might misinterpret that and say, oh, Eveleen's making that conversation about herself. It's not all about you. That's not what I was doing. I was actually empathizing, but how I expressed that was misinterpreted maybe by someone who's not autistic. Damien Milton is an autistic psychologist. He has a really interesting theory around empathy, and he calls it the double empathy theory. You know, okay, yeah, autistic people may have difficulty reading body language and all of these social cues that are being sent to us by non-autistics, but we can spin that around. And there's a double empathy issue because non-autistics also have a really hard time understanding us. You know, look at all the stuff that's been written about us. You know, again, I suppose it's hard to understand us when you don't ask us questions, and Q does. You know, that whole idea of making friends I covered a minute ago, you know, we can't make a friend by ourselves. We have to have someone who's willing to be a friend. Playing, and Frank is going to talk about this after. You know, there's just so many stories about autistic children playing wrong. You know, play is a natural thing that we do naturally. It's part of our development. It's part of how we learn and explore the world, and, you know, build a picture of ourselves in relation to the world. That's what we're doing when we're playing. Why would an autistic child be doing anything different? That's what they're doing too. You know, but again, there's all of these stories out there about teaching your child to play right. You know, based on this idea that we don't have social skills, and if we don't learn to play like the other children, then we won't ever have those social skills. But the fact that we have social skills, lack social skills, isn't actually true in the first place. So again, a lot of these stuff are based, you know, each story is based on the other story, and none of it actually has a solid foundation. You know, things like taking turns. You know, I've had lots of classes with autistic children who have no issue taking turns. I've had kids in all my classes who might have an issue, you know, taking turn because they're anxious. They might not know when their turn is. So that's up to me to communicate that clearly to them. You know, somebody mightn't have the same concept of time that I have. It might be really difficult to wait if you don't know whether it's a day or a minute, you know, if it feels like you're waiting a long time. But like, so much of that comes back to anxiety and how we feel about ourselves as well. Sharing, again, lots of autistic people are accused of actually oversharing, saying too much, sharing too much of ourselves. And as children, we're told we don't share or we need to share. You know, do we live in a world where everyone shares? You know, do you get paid on a Thursday and divide your wages amongst all your friends, or do you keep it to yourself? And why are we teaching autistic children to just hand over their belongings because somebody else needs it? You know, yes, we share and we show kindness, and we show kindness when we share and all of that. And I see autistic children doing that all the time. But what is it that they don't want to share? Is it something that's very, very precious to them? Is there a specific connection to them that you don't understand as an outsider? Because a lot of us can be very connected to our things and the world around us. So, you know, this pen I'm holding or this stone might be really, really important to me. And if someone wants to take it away, it might be like asking for my child, you know, but because someone else just sees it as a stone or a pen, they're not understanding that connection. So they're like, oh, that child needs to be taught how to share, without actually investigating why is it that child really, really wants to hang on to this thing. So there are lots and lots of stories that have been told about us. And the messages that we get as autistics from a young age, you know, are you're rude for just saying what you're thinking. You're blunt for not fluffing up what you want to say and use language in a way that's not natural to us. You can't communicate. This is what every living thing communicates. Why would autistic children be unable to communicate when everything around us basically is communicating with us? You know, why would someone even presume and make that assumption that we can't communicate? We're always communicating, you know, and communication isn't just speech. That's something we really need to work on as a society, realizing that communication is far more than what we say to each other. You know, we get messages telling us that we're cheeky because we took something literally. We're told to sit still when it might actually be really hard for us to sit still. You know, and when someone's saying sit still, we're learning that our way of moving, or that the way we have, you know, to be comfortable isn't acceptable. But I need to move to feel comfortable. Well, sit still. What's that telling a child? It's telling them that, well, you actually have to be uncomfortable. You know, and then that child learns, well, being uncomfortable is just how I exist in this world. And it doesn't matter if I'm uncomfortable. I don't even tell people anymore. You know, so it's really important that we don't send these messages to kids. You know, stop embarrassing me. You know, I would have heard that, you know, from different people in my life. for things I said or things I was doing, or maybe a stim or something like that. What I do as a person isn't a reflection of anybody else. And we have this idea as adults sometimes that our children, or as parents, that our children somehow, things they do, is an extension of us or a reflection of us. And we get embarrassed. But I think we need to look at that as well. Is there a need for us to do that? It's a child doing something. And if somebody wants to read into that, well, that's their business. Being told we're not concentrating when we are. When we're moving about, we are concentrating. A lot of us will fidget and stim, and this is us concentrating, and then we're told we're not concentrating, or we look like we're not concentrating because we're looking away or looking out the window. It looks like we're daydreaming. There's a huge assumption that we're not concentrating. Telling people we don't know what it's like, you can't understand, all of this kind of thing. These are all of the messages that we get from all of these stories that are told around us in our social world. We also get messages like, don't be so dramatic. If a child gets really upset about a bruised apple, I was in the supermarket a few weeks ago, and the little kid dropped an apple, and he was like, Dad, the apple is bruised. And he was just so upset. And to somebody else, they might be like, it's just an apple. But to somebody who sees that apple as something valuable and is really disappointed and upset that now it's bruised, they're two different experiences. It's not being dramatic. They're just expressing how, actually that feels to them. Which is interesting because perspectives. There's people here today, people watching the recording. You're not all going to come away with the same perspective. You're not all going to have the same experience today, because we're humans. We come at things with different experiences and different thoughts and different stages in our life. It's going to affect how we perceive something. So we can't say that one person's perception is right and one person's perception is wrong. It's your perception. It's real to you. We're often told it's not loud. Teacher, it's really loud. It's not loud. How many kids are communicating their discomfort from the sensory surroundings, saying it's too loud, and being told it's not. And that's, again, judging your perception and your experience, and thinking that the other person is just experiencing the environment the same way as you are. We don't. No two humans will experience it the same. If this was a live session, which I have done obviously before COVID, I could be in a room with 25, 30 people, and I'll be saying, is the room too cold for anybody? Is it too hot? There's always going to be one or two people who have their coats on while everybody else has the windows open. We don't experience the world the same. So by telling someone it's not loud or it's not cold, we're invalidating their experience. And this is important because these are the messages that autistic kids get. That we're experiencing the world wrong. We're imagining this stuff that actually, it's not. It's not. What does that mean? But I'm cold, or it's too loud for me. I'll just mask my discomfort and just keep going because there's no solution to this. Sometimes children get these messages like, this is something that happens a lot in schools, through no fault of the wonderful teachers and SNAs that we have, but this is what they're trained, to talk to the autistic child and say, good listening. Good listening. So the autistic child is held to this kind of ridiculous standard that no other child is. I remember being in a school another day, and there was a junior or senior infants lined up, 30 boys, and they're all kind of chatting and bouncing off each other, waiting to go home. And there's an SNA standing next to the autistic child saying, good listening, good waiting. Why does the autistic child have to good listening and do good waiting when all the other kids are just being kids? What message is that sending the child? And this is, again, well-meaning messages, people with the best of intentions, but look at the messages that we're getting. You need to concentrate. We're telling someone who's finding it hard to concentrate that you need to concentrate. It's like telling someone who's upset to calm down. It's not that easy. It's not like, oh, I can just concentrate now. Thanks for telling me. What do we need to remember? And this is important because obviously we're here today talking to parents. We are sensitive. You can talk about autism and read autism books, but when you boil it all down, we're sensitive creatures. we're sensitive. And if we're sensitive to the sensory environment and the physical environment and the lights and the sounds and the noises and the tastes and the textures and the touch feel around us, we're going to be sensitive to the messages that we get from our social world. And that sensory input is probably the most overlooked sensory input when research is done on autism and people talk about autism. You know, we don't look at, well, what sensory input are they getting from the social world, from the people around them? You know, because that's what we need to look at. It's also important to remember that the sensitive child, we're going to feel more shame, we're going to feel embarrassed, we're going to blame ourselves, we're going to beat ourselves up about things that we did wrong. We're going to feel bad enough about that already, you know, because we're so sensitive, and we're sensitive about how you feel about us, and we don't like letting people down. And it's really important to remember that sensitivity when we interact with our kids. This is like a little summary for people to kind of, I suppose, think about how autistic people communicate. You know, we do communicate literally. And for us, words have a purpose outside of the social context. So, you know, when I started looking at non-autistic and autistic communication, it became obvious that autistic people, we like to share information with each other. We get excited about new information and we want to share it. It's not that we can't do chit chat, but if you look at the psychology underneath chit chat, it's actually goes back to being part of a social hierarchy where people are sussing each other out to see where they fit in that social hierarchy. In autistic culture, everybody's equal. There is no social hierarchy. So, you know, what's the point of chit chat? Because we're not trying to figure out where we are in that social hierarchy or where you are. We just accept everybody is equal to ourselves. And for many of us, that can extend beyond humans, and we can see animals and, you know, things in the world as equal to ourselves. And that's how we're connected to it. And that's why we're sensitive. Again, people can be told they're cheeky if they don't have respect for authority. But again, if we don't have a social hierarchy, I'm not just going to accept rules because you told me or because you're the teacher or because you're my parent. You know, you're equal to me. And that's something that's really important. We brought it up at the PGA webinar as well recently, because if your child's autistic and they see themselves as an equal, they're going to see you as an equal as well. So if you actually treat them as an equal, you'll get a very different response to that kind of authoritarian parenting. Movement is our first language, speech is our second. You can see as I'm talking, I'm moving my hands all over the place. It's part of how I actually get the words out. Stimming is how we communicate, or I would say our language is more energetic, and speech is our second. Again, eye contact is not part of our communication for many of us. And just, you know, we are in constant communication with our world, not just the people in it. We're always interacting with the world. Just because people think we're not engaged doesn't mean that we're, you know, because we're not talking to the person in the room next with us. We're fully engaged in what's going on in the world. There's a beautiful video. It's called In My Language on YouTube. Mel Baggs was an autistic advocate who passed away last year, unfortunately, but left this video where they're actually, you know, it's half the video, it's 15 minutes, half the video is them interacting with everything in their apartment. And the second half is them using an AAC device to explain what they're doing. And it really explains that kind of connection that we have as autistics with the world. And that language isn't just words, and how, you know, and communication is so much more than that. It's important to remember that we are often forced to mask who we really are, to hide our pain and discomfort, so that other people, you know, feel comfortable around us. I'm just watching my time because, as always, I have too many slides. A green stop sign. I use this quite a lot to explain to people what it can be like when you're a direct communicator and you're living in a world where people are sending you mixed messages. So if someone, you know, is saying, I'm fine, you know, I'm fine. So they're telling you with the words they're fine, but their voice is saying they're not, or they can have a facial expression that doesn't match what they're saying. That can be really confusing. We can pick up the messages, but be left confused going, which message do I go with? And it's like any of us driving up towards a stop sign and it's green. Green is telling me go, the words are telling me stop. How would you know? How would you possibly know whether to stop or go? How would you naturally know this? You wouldn't. You would need somebody to pull up alongside you and say, in this world, in this place here we're in now, we don't listen to the words. We just go with what the color is saying. So ignore the words and go. Green is telling us go. Just go with the color. You wouldn't know that naturally. You would need somebody to explain that to you. So I have a few more tips, like avoiding vague phrasing, because we're not all visual and not all autistic people are. But for those of us that are, if you're specific, it helps me build a picture in my mind. If you're just giving me a vague phrase, if you say, how was school? I'm like, does she mean the building? Does she mean the class? Does she mean what I do with the kids? What does she mean? You know, I'm trying to figure out what the question meant instead of actually building a picture of what you're asking me. So being more specific and asking more specific questions can actually really help conversation flow better. If there's a pause, people call this like a processing delay. I call it more of a translating delay. So we're trying to translate. So if there's a pause, it can be a sign that you need to maybe rephrase what you said. You know, we have a habit, if someone doesn't understand, hasn't responded, where, you know, pass me the milk. And, you know, then we're like, pass me the milk. And we just keep repeating the same thing instead of rephrasing it. So rephrasing it can often help us to build that picture in our head, or to make us understand what you're saying a bit easier. It's important to, you know, we're literal communicators. So that means, yeah, we might interpret things literally, but also we're going to say things literally. So we're going to just say what we mean. It works both ways. You know, I talked about the kids saying, oh, it's too loud or whatever. Our responses need to be validated and not dismissed. And that's really important, because we are dismissed. Our needs are dismissed a lot of the time because people who are experiencing the word in a different way presume we're experiencing it in the same way. There's this idea that we overreact, or the autistic child is overreacting, but we can't really overreact. You can only react. It's just that people don't understand what we're reacting to. And you know, if you've had all of these bad experiences in your social world, and then somebody says something critical to you, you're not just responding to that critical response there and then, you're responding to all of the other stuff that's happened, you know. So again, if we say someone's overreacting, we can be dismissing what they're actually reacting to. So we do need to look at the environment. A few more tips: be conscious of our social anxiety. A lot of us have bad experiences in our social world. You know, we feel rejected, we feel wrong. That's going to lead us to being anxious about meeting new people, about going to new places, you know, about what this person's going to think. You know, Owen talked earlier on about like self-talk, and, you know, this idea that we, you know, negative self-talk in our head, we're going to think negatively. It's important to be conscious of this and making places feel safer for us, because there's no point pushing a kid into a world where they don't feel safe. That's going to just, you know, have adverse effects. We need to feel safe. So it's about, you know, increasing those safe spaces, getting to know stims, what they communicate, remembering that, you know, communication works both ways, and so do miscommunication. It's not like it's always the autistic person's fault if a miscommunication happens. You know, and let's be honest, autistic to autistic we're going to have miscommunications. A non-autistic person, their communication with another non-autistic person is not always perfect. There's going to be miscommunications. We're human. There's room for error. There's room for misinterpretation. You know, we also pick up on the emotional energy of the room. So that's great. If everyone's feeling good, it can be, maybe if everyone's feeling too good and hyper, you know, we'll be the ones still hyper 10 minutes later. Or, you know, if people are feeling anxious around us, we can pick up on that anxiety as well. You know, and just try and think of what messages. I think this is what I do as a mom. It's like, well, what message is my child getting from, you know, if I say this? What message, what is she learning when I say this? And we need to look at the messages that our children are receiving, you know, in school, from peers, from family, and find ways to balance it, because we can give our own messages of positivity and of acceptance and of love. Other things to remember: time with other autistics, so important. I feed my soul. Today is a wonderful day talking to other autistic people. I would have loved the opportunity as a kid to, you know, hang out with more autistic kids. I'm sure most of my friends that I've gone, you know, had throughout my life have been neurodiverse in some way. We can build our confidence. We can feel comfortable around them. We can, you know, we have a place in the world. That helps us when we go out into a social world, which is predominantly non-autistic. It's important that we have access to AAC, and that's not just for kids who maybe are, you know, are non-speaking. It's also for people who, you know, it can be stressful to speak, or we, you know, in a situation where we are selective, you know, we go mute, we might be more comfortable typing, we might be more comfortable texting or drawing a picture, whatever, learning sign language. It's good to have options around communication. It's important to remember that, you know, communication is a two-way thing. So meeting us halfway would be brilliant. It's about learning about autistic communication, teaching other people about it, and adapting. You know, autistics have spent our whole lives adapting, hiding how we communicate, trying to, you know, fulfill all of these demands on us. So we do need other people to understand our way of communicating and to adapt to it. You know, and that's a huge part of acceptance and understanding and respecting our communication. And obviously, you know, a non-sensory hostile environment, I'm a better communicator when I'm not meeting someone in a busy cafe with all this noise going on around us. So we're human. The most important story we can tell about autistic people is that we are human, and that's often forgotten about, unfortunately. So we respond to human stimuli and human interactions in human ways. You can sometimes replace the question, why does my autistic child do this, with just, why does my child do this? Because it's a human reaction. It's a human child that we're talking about. You know, if our social environment is good, then we feel good. And then we'll live happily ever after.